Welcome to a very exciting edition of Rebellion's educational series. I was reading machine learning papers the other night, and I came across a website of Dr. Charles Martin, a machine learning practitioner in San Francisco, and I was blown away by his work. And I said to myself, my God, this man gets it. Not only does he get it, but he's so much smarter than me. I need to get him on the show immediately so that we can all learn from him. And we're going to talk about theoretical physics and how it can improve deep learning. Dr. Martin, who also, by the way, works with the Page family from Google's Climate Change Institute. This man is super brilliant. I literally came across him from his work. So I'm a very tough critic. So Dr. Martin, thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to learn about theoretical physics and deep learning.
Well, I really appreciate that. It's funny when I started writing this blog. One of my staff guys is a really good software engineer. And he goes, why are you writing this blog? So I started like 10 years ago. Because it's stuff I'm interested in. He goes, nobody's going to read this. And I go, yeah, they will. You'll see. People will find it interesting. And
I think your blog is fantastic.
You discovered me.
No, absolutely excellent.
I really appreciate that. I'm not really trying to promote it as much like doing SEO. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to work on things that I think are interesting and have impact, and trying to figure out how we can really have impact on some really hard problems. I think deep learning is a very interesting problem, and we're trying to have impact on it.
So how are we going to use theoretical physics to improve our deep learning?
Let me tell you the story about this, okay? So, I did my postdoctoral work in the 90s. In theoretical physics at Champaign-Urbana. And back in those days, AI was a big subject in theoretical physics. People loved doing theoretical physics and AI. It was a big thing, and we studied the stuff. And then it sort of died. It sort of went away. When the Cold War ended, a lot of the funding for physics dried up, and everybody either went off to Wall Street or Silicon Valley and started doing this stuff. And deep learning kind of disappeared into the academic realm. And, we all went off into industry and, tried to make a living and do interesting work. And, about, 10 years ago or so, this stuff started getting hot again. Now, I have a friend, Michael Mahoney at UC Berkeley, who was also an old theoretical chemist and physicist like me. And we were at a machine learning conference. And I said to him, this machine learning stuff looks a lot like the old theories of protein folding. And I go, oh, really? I have a blog post on that. And then we got to talking, and he convinced me to start working with him as a collaborator in UC Berkeley to start figuring how can we use some of these older ideas from theoretical physics to figure out what's going on in deep learning. And that's how it all started. You might know about this protein folding stuff. Do you know about the AlphaFold coming out of Google?
Yes, no, of course.
So that was basically developed by my graduate advisor.
Really?
So he started working on this stuff, I don't know, in the 90s as well. And he has a student, he's been working on it for a very long time, the theories of protein folding. So protein folding and AI go way back, and they're connected to each other. They're because in the old days, the 90s, the old days, people thought that proteins were like little neural networks. And what they would do is when the body evolved, it would learn how to process chemical reactions. And they sort of thought that a protein, an enzyme, was kind of like a neural network that was learning how to, over millions of years, learning how to process a chemical reaction. So people who were studying protein folding were studying neural networks, and they had models called spin glass models, and they were looking at all this stuff. And, years and years go by, and my advisor, he had a very bright student, John Jumper, super bright guy, who worked on the protein folding stuff. And what happened was Google hired Jumper, and they basically redid, they souped up his thesis using, the 2 million supercomputers that they have. And so a lot of the protein folding stuff was developed. It took many, many decades of research to figure out how to build these models. And so we were looking at this stuff way back then, thinking about it. And I remember I was talking to my advisor. He comes and visits San Francisco. His granddaughter lives here. And he would come and visit every summer. And I go sit down with him. We talk for several hours about what's going on in science. What is he working on? What am I working on? And he was telling me about the work they were doing in protein folding, before AlphaFold was released, back when it was still a project in Chicago. And we got to talking about, just general theories of protein folding and sort of the older work on, how, what are called rugged energy landscapes and spin glasses. And I said, I think we can apply this stuff to deep learning. He goes, I didn't believe me. That was crazy. Come on, that stuff is, ancient stuff. But, I started thinking about it, and I gave a talk at UC Berkeley, and I started working the problem. And what it was doing, like basically Michael Mahoney, my friend, and I, every week for like the past 5 years, we would get on the phone at night for, a couple hours, 2-3 hours a week at least, and just talk. And we just talk. What do you think about this? What about that? You would just talk. And it was very much, when you think about like what is the scientific discovery process like? We're just kind of like wandering around in the dark, bumping around. We don't really know what we're doing. We're reading old papers. We don't really understand them. We're trying to guess our way through them. And then, we sort of find some people who know what's going on, and we ask them about the papers, and we read some old books. And then over time, the more we talked about it, the more we looked at papers, things started to gel. And eventually we came up, I got this idea to look at, to try to we try to ask, what are the fundamental problems that people don't really understand about deep learning? So like some of the problems are like, well, it appears to be a giant non-convex optimization problem. And yet, when you look at the problem in any numerical work, you never get trapped in any local minimum. So how can that be? How can this thing, which is presumably this giant non-convex optimization problem, somehow be ruggedly convex? Of course, we knew this from protein theory, that this is how proteins work. Proteins are basically giant, rugged, convex funnels.
Well,
But we
that's the
didn't know
problem
how
with gradient descent, right? That it gets stuck in the local minimums all the
right,
time.
you would think it would. But there's actually very little evidence that it does. It appears to just be you just go downhill all the time. And people, and it appears that it's all saddle points. Like there aren't that many local minima. Now, there was a paper that came out by Lee Kun and some Russians, I think, which was trying to apply the spin glass theory to argue that, well, when you train a neural network, you kind of get to the bottom, and you kind of get to the bottom. It's kind of like, it's just kind of like the bottom of your toilet bowl. And anywhere you go, you bounce around. It's all local minima everywhere. And, there were these kind of theories. People thought this. And I looked at this and I said, this is nonsense. This doesn't make any sense, because these models they're using are based on something called Gaussian spin glasses. They're based on random systems. And if you think about when you're learning something, or you're trying to, you learn a neural network, you learn the weights of a neural network. The weights of a neural network, the patterns that it learns, these are the most non-random things you could think of. I mean, obviously, if you're learning patterns and the neural network is learning patterns, those patterns cannot possibly be random. And so if you look at the theory that everybody had, they would say, well, let's assume that there is the weight matrix and it's Gaussian. And to say that it's Gaussian is to say that it's the most random object you could imagine. And I said, that's totally wrong. It should be the least random object you can imagine. And that means it's a strongly correlated system. Now, if you then go back and look, and then we had to kind of dig back through the theoretical physics literature and figure this stuff out. And go ahead, you want to ask a question?
I was going to say, should it be the least minimum or the least random, or should it be somewhere in the middle between?
An excellent question, because if it's too correlated, then how does it generalize? Right? Mm-hmm. If it has to have a little bit of randomness in it somehow, how could it predict something else? That's another interesting problem that comes up in learning. Like, you train a model. Is it actually learning, or is it just memorizing? Nobody knows. Like, people talk about this. Maybe it's memorizing. We don't really know. So that's an excellent point. And so we've been studying this problem by saying, we said, well, I started thinking about it. What would it mean to generalize? And it means so these ideas about strongly correlated systems, things that are highly non-random, they're not objects that statisticians really look at. Statisticians don't look at non-random things. Who does? I'll tell you who does look at non-random stuff are accountants, because they have something called, what is the name of that law? They were trying to use it to detect election fraud. What's the name of the law they used to detect election fraud? Benford's law. Sorry, it's stuff buried in here somewhere. Benford's law says that if you look at distributions of the first digits of sequences of numbers, that distribution follows a power law of decay. And that's actually used by accountants to do things like detect accounting fraud. So, but statisticians never look at things like this. So we knew about these heavy-tailed, strongly correlated systems because they arise in what's called electronic structure theory. But they arise in another place that your audience might be more familiar with, finance. They come in finance when you're trying to study the covariance matrix of a portfolio. They're strongly correlated systems.
Yeah. Now, we started out as a finance blog, really, but now I'd say we're probably a third military, third space, and
well, that's
third
cool.
quant.
That's cool. That's cool. So the thing is that it's if you ask yourself now, what would it mean? Let me pose a basic question to you. If you're a neural network guy and you train a neural network model, here's a very basic question. Let's suppose I look at the neural network. How do you know if it's overtrained or not? How do you know if it actually learned something or if it just memorized all the examples?
That's
and
a
how would you
question.
know?
Yeah.
And how would you know without looking at the test data?
Oh,
So
the R
suppose
squared?
or
Yeah.
anything, any example. Let's say you have no.
Well, you'd want to go through it and look for, if it looks clean in any way, it's not kosher. It has to, the randomness has to be distributed in a truly random. I like your mention before, because it is true with accounting fraud, and and that is that's just not the way numbers distribute. So no, I like the way your mind works.
So the thing is that imagine why you would want to do this. Like, why would you care? Okay, let's say you're building a self-driving car. Okay, now we talked to the CTO of one of the we talked to the CTO of Intel about this. It's actually in our paper. We talk about this. He says to me, I got to put this thing in a car. So, if you got to put an AI in a car, you can't test it on every single example. Of course, that's what they have to do, right? They have to build like Grand Theft Auto type simulation. I love playing Grand Theft Auto. They have to drive it through Grand Theft Auto. They make a simulator. And
My
you have to
high
test the
school
AI.
sweethearts, my high school girlfriend of 5 years, his father was the chairman actually of Take-Two Software, Grand Theft Auto. So I knew the company very well. And
I played it back in the 90s when it was just a 2D game.
Yeah, no, that's when. Robert Flug, he was chair of the company, maybe in the late '90s, early 2000s. But amazing company, Rockstar. The number of their very, very cool company.
Imagine though, like you're training a neural network, and you want to know. Look, I need to put this thing on a device. I need to compress it down and put it on a chip.
Yeah.
And I need to know that when I do this, I'm not going to break it in some way. Or, I want this thing to. We had a client, for example.
Usually, you don't break the system. It's the input data that gets broken. 9 times out of 10, when the system fails, it's not the system; it's the input data that I found, at least.
Well, the problem is if you modify the model in some way, and you don't know that you tweaked it, you broke it somehow, then it will respond to the input data differently. But you won't know that unless you test every single example. That's very expensive. If you're building a self-driving car, we have friends of mine here who run the self-driving car groups. They spend $10, $12 million a pop to buy data sets to test their cars on. They could easily spend $25 million on a data set just to do a test. This stuff's expensive. You're looking at $5 to $10 an example because it's so hard to make sure. So getting test data to test these systems is very expensive and very time consuming. It's very difficult. And, so we asked this, I'll give you another example. Let's say you're a trader and, you're trading in finance and you build a neural network model. We can't test it on the data. If you back test it, you might, like with all models, it might overfit the data. So it's very hard to build models.
You have to limit, that's something I talk about frequently. You have to limit the amount of input data. You have to limit the test data. You have to be very sparing in your data usage because data is very limited, quite frankly.
Right. So imagine if you had a way of looking at your model and saying, I can predict how well this thing is going to perform. without ever looking at the test data. And so if I have a series of models, I'm tweaking parameters, like I'm tweaking the hyperparameters. Imagine if you could tweak the hyperparameters and know whether you should go up or down or tweak left or right without ever having to look at the test data. That's what so those are the kind of questions we started asking, is really basic fundamental questions. And I said, they're kind of applied questions because I'm kind of thinking you would do that. But of course, they're also very deep theoretical questions. And this led us to realize that what we want to do is we want to look at the weight matrices of the neural network, and we want to analyze them. All the information about a neural network is in its weight matrices.
100%.
So I built a tool, called it Weight Watcher. And we call it the Weight Watcher project. And it's a little
Yes,
Python
you have some
tool.
wonderful blog posts on your Weight Watcher project, which
that's what I've been blogging for the past year about, because I'm obsessed with it.
Which is your UC Berkeley partnership on.
Yes. These guys are great. They go and these guys can go. They can publish anywhere. They can go to any conference. Michael gave, he's been a great collaborator. He's a great sounding board. Really picks things up quick. He gave the best paper talk at NeurIPS this year. We submitted a paper to NeurIPS, and then they rejected the paper. Oh, this paper is just experimental. There's no theory behind it. I'm like, well, there's theory, but I can't write a paper on Anderson localization, submit it to NIPS. So we write this paper. It's a contest. We said we propose. Here's what we proposed. Let's say you take every pre-trained model that's ever been made. So hundreds of them, right? And you know what their accuracy is. Like all the computer vision models trained on ImageNet. There's hundreds of them now. And then you try to predict, can you predict what the test accuracy would be on those models, or at least predict like the regression? Can you form a regression line on those models without ever having to look at the training data? So we proposed this, we wrote a paper on it, we showed that you can do it, and we submitted it. They rejected it, for some ridiculous reason. Then they submitted their own contest called this NeurIPS contest, where they're trying to do something very similar. I'm like, well, there you go, So we tried to enter the contest, and we have a paper coming out where we talk about the contest and like what they did in their contest and how it's different from what we were doing and what we learned. But we learned all sorts of things from doing this. And but it's that idea that if I could look at a neural network and understand why, if I could tell you, could I tell you, is it overtrained or undertrained? Could I predict how well it's going to do without looking at the data, or at least not looking at the test data? So it turns out you can do these things. And many of these ideas and the idea comes from going back and thinking about, what do we know about the theoretical physics of these models back in the 90s? And what do we know about them today? And what can we use from that information of physics? I'm not trying to make I'm not trying to write physics papers or derive equations. I'm trying to use what we learned about these models from physics to give us insights into why deep learning works today. And so we've made quite a lot of progress with this. We have a tool. It's a Python tool. You install it. It will show you little pictures of your weight matrices. And then we have papers we're trying to write, which will tell you how to interpret. So let me give you an example. You have a weight matrix of a neural network. And you're trained, we regularize the matrix, right? You try to add an L2 regular, you try to make it small when you train it, you try to add constraints. So during the learning process, it doesn't overtrain, it doesn't overfit to the data. You want to be able to, you want the model to be able to describe examples and make predictions on things it's never seen before, right? That's the whole point. So it turns out every once in a while, if you look at the weight matrices, there's like this large element that sticks out of the weight matrix. It's like, it's too large. It shouldn't be there. I call it a correlation trap. And this is an idea from theoretical physics that the weight matrix becomes atypical.
I like that correlation trap. I'm going to use that. May I steal that from you?
Trap, yeah.
Dr.
Correlation
Martin.
Trap, absolutely.
As my buddy Dr. Martin says, correlation trap. I'm going to be using that now. Thank you. I will cite you, but
I'm working on the blog post. Yeah, we have a paper coming out on that eventually. These papers.
I like that. I'm going to use that now for my lectures. Correlation trap. That's wonderful. I wish I had thought of that.
Well, use it. It's not a trademark.
Well, why don't you tell all of our viewers about your blog first? I don't want our viewers to miss.
I have a blog.
Please plug your blog.
The blog is called Calculated Content. Calculated Content. It was going to be a startup. I had a startup.
We'll have a link to it on the website as well.
And on there, recently I've been discussing a lot of the work in the Weight Watcher project. In the past, I would just discuss general machine learning, like, the relationship between, like, what's a kernel?
I liked your What's a Kernel post. Have you?
That was my most popular post.
Did you? Do you have an opinion on reinforcement learning before I let you go? RL is something we talk about a lot because it's so hot right now in finance.
It's very hard. It's very, I do consulting work with clients, so I have to propose things to people to do. And usually if I don't get something done, like, if I have usually about 3-month window, and if you don't produce results, people they'll usually, pay you half the money. I will give you half the money because, you got to produce stuff. Reinforcement. So we try to pick tools that give results that are easy to use and give quick results that you can actually generate revenue from. Reinforcement learning is very hard to do. It's very technical. It requires a lot of expertise. We know, for example, I have friends out here who try to make reinforcement learning for gaming. It's very difficult to run without an expert really tweaking it. That's what I would say about it. It's a great idea, right? It's just very, very hard to do. It's not for, as opposed to some of this other stuff, you can do on your own. Even for me, it's a very, very complicated thing. It's really an expert's tool. And so you really have to devote the time to it. And you should expect that if you get involved in a reinforcement learning project, that it's going to be serious research. And I would not try to make plug and play products out of it. Like, I wouldn't try to make a product you can hand to someone or hand off to another team and just expect them to use it. It really requires an expert operator.
Do you see a field where gradient descent might take hold, like an industry maybe? Or if you want to, give our viewers just a little bit on, where you could see it having practical application?
I think the issue with deep learning and the gradient descent techniques. By the way, I'm going to point something out. See, about 10 years ago when people were doing machine learning, it wasn't all obvious that you could use stochastic gradient descent to solve every problem. This wasn't obvious. People were doing like bundle solvers and interior point methods and things like this. When we were I was at Quant at Barclays and then at BlackRock. And, we were doing, portfolio optimization on non-convex problems. And, we would try to you try to convexify the problem and use an interior point solver, or you would try to use some Lagrange multiply. It was not at all obvious. In those days, these were difficult problems for optimization. And it's not at all obvious that gradient descent would work and now it just seems to work on every single problem. It's somewhat amazing. And I think, we think the reason that it works is because you have these very large complex neural networks that basically create a rugged energy landscape. So the problem is basically effectively convex within a certain noise level. It's one of our hypotheses that we're working on.
I think that makes sense. I think that's true, especially in a lot of areas in finance.
And this contradicts some of the stuff that Lee Kahn and other people have said, where they think, oh no, you kind of go downhill and there are all these local men and all the local men are degenerate. I'm like, that's not. We don't think it's this is a complicated theoretical problem, but I think the application to this stuff, when I work with clients, it's very much dependent on what it really is very much dependent on the kind of data you have and the quality of it and your ability to really get at it. To really get at it and really work through and apply models to it. And it's because a lot of companies, they treat collecting data like you're just stuffing stuff into your garage. I'm gonna get a bunch of boxes. I'm gonna put stuff in my garage. I'm gonna stuff it in the garage, and that's great. But when you have to go into the garage at the end of the summer to find a wrench, what box is it in? If you've stuffed your garage with 300 boxes, and you need to change the wheel on your car.
That's a good point. When you think about how many data sets, for instance, the U.S. Army might have, When you imagine how many actual AI scientists are really examining each data set, probably at best, maybe 1%, 5%, something very, very, very small. But
No, you really have to make an effort. Look, when BlackRock acquired Lehman Brothers, I think Lehman Brothers had something like 2,000 databases. There were more databases than there were customers. You know, it was just crazy. How are we supposed to go through all this?
great
So
point.
I
No,
think
really
that,
great point.
so this is a real problem I see working with clients. I mean, there are some clients I come into, demand media. We work with demand media. eHow. Do you remember eHow.com? Probably you're too young to remember eHow. You're a young, handsome guy. You don't remember eHow.
Very sweet. I don't know how.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, eHow was the biggest thing since sliced bread. We were like one of the top 10 websites in the country. We had like, so basically what I did, and I don't mean this in the legal sense, essentially, I wouldn't say reverse engineered, but we developed an algorithm called the answer factory. It was called the answer factory algorithm, which allowed us to predict how much traffic we could get on Google for a web page, like an SEO page, before we wrote it. So we were generating like 200,000 pieces, and we were the first $1 billion IPO since Google.
Well, that's very cool. I mean, if you can do that, you've got significant value. Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, Google after that, Google changed all their algorithms and they changed CEOs. You know, it's just because we basically effectively we were like in 7 of 10 Google searches.
It's amazing how much of small, medium, and even large businesses depend on just Google and Facebook to communicate with their customers.
It's very opaque. What they don't they used to tell you more about what was
it is
going
very
on.
opaque indeed. Yes.
So we were able to use machine learning, and this was 10 years ago. I went with a client. I went down to LA and worked with Demand Media. Super nice guys. I love going down there. I would go down to Santa Monica, you know, and stay on Ocean Boulevard in the hotels. You know, they wouldn't let me. You know, they didn't like us in the hotel. They didn't want us in the restaurant because the movie stars would come and have hotel parties in the restaurants, and CTO would sit. We'd sit with our laptops and hack all night. So we were sitting there hacking while all the movie stars and the athletes are hanging out. But I went in and worked with them. Within a month of working with Demand Media, I developed the first prototype algorithm, and we knew immediately that we could increase revenue by 500% immediately. And within 3 months, we had it working in production, and then we went IPO. And then after that, and then of course Google. I have actually a video on the Haas Business School. I have a case study I do to talk about what happened with Demand Media and how Google changed all their algorithms and things. And then the CTO went off and worked for a company in New York called GLG. You know these guys?
Yes, Gerson.
Right. So I was there I was distinguished engineer at GLG for a while, and I worked with those. So those were eHow guys. Great, good stuff. Great guys. They've all changed now, like they've changed senior management and everything. But when I was there, it was kind of like eHow for it was Q&A, but for the street. So I went over to Demand Media, and within a month, we knew what was going to happen. We knew we could do this. I've had other clients I go into. I work with them for 3 months just to create one pandas data frame. I just can't work. The data is just,
Wow, so many points we've covered from dealing with your data to gradient descent. This has really just been an absolutely awesome episode, Dr. Martin. We're really at the end of our show, but you have just been an absolutely fantastic guest. I hope you'll come back on. I'd be very sad if you did not, and we continue this conversation on new and fantastic subjects.
Well, I really appreciate you having me. Stop by the blog. Pip install Weight Watcher. We even have a Slack channel.
Yes. One last plug of your blog.
Calculated Content.
Wonderful. CalculatedContent.com. The brilliant Charles Martin, Dr. Charles Martin. Thank you so much. Stay safe. You're really just an A-plus guest.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's very honored to be here.
Oh, and you've got great work. Everybody needs to go read your blogs. Good night.
Thank you.